Thanks for joining us to talk about what does network monitoring mean in the cloud. My name is Brandon Shop, and I am a GVP of product here at SolarWinds. I've been at SolarWinds for about a decade now, and my background is in network engineering. So I started out as a network engineer uh, before I joined SolarWinds, and I actually shifted into software and have been the product manager for the Orion platform, Network Performance Monitor, and many other products here in the SolarWinds family. With me today, I have Satish. Satish, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, welcome to our session here. My name is Satish Grandi. I head the office of the CTO at SolarWinds. My experience is has been in the networking field for over 15 to 20 years. I started my career off as a network performance management developer at Nortel Networks. Went into protocol development across the entire networking stack with a lot of experience on in Juniper on the SDN and the NFV space, and did a startup after that with being the first hybrid cloud management platform that was dealing with cloud and the migration to the cloud of the applications. And then I was a chief architect at Pulse Secure, looking at zero trust technologies and the SASE and SD-WAN technologies. Um, I believe we're going to kick it off with market trends, Brandon. On to you.
Yeah, no, sounds great. Let's go ahead and dive in and talk about, as you said, some of the market trends we've been seeing out there. And so, in talking with customers, one of the things that we are hearing and seeing more about is the leveraging of clouds, and as well the moving of workloads from on premises traditionally over to the cloud. And so, with these trends, along with several other trends that are driving the evolution of the network performance monitoring market. Network visibility is critical. Even in a shared responsibility model where the cloud service provider is ultimately responsible for many aspects of the network infrastructure. As an end user, you are still responsible for securing, configuring, and kind of maintaining, those services and how you're leveraging them yourself. And so we're no longer constrained, to our infrastructure and the services residing solely, kind of within the virtual four walls of our corporate environments. Hybrid cloud architectures, services, and the apps are driving the need, for NPM tools to support those end-to-end views of those transactions, not only in a traditional on-premises environment, but also, in hybrid and pure cloud environments. Additionally to that, there's been broad adoption of, software-defined networking technologies and NFV technologies, such as SASE and SD-WAN. And others are ultimately automating or driving organizations to automate the provisioning and, forcing performance management tools to also follow as well. So, Satish, what are you seeing out there from a trend perspective?
Yeah, Brandon, as organizations are evolving and introducing these newer technologies into their networking stack and the operation stack, what this has done is has increased the complexity of their environments, right? Be it the move to the cloud, and it's not one single cloud that the end customers are moving to. They are actually doing multiple clouds, right?
Mhm.
And they cannot lift and shift their existing environment, so they are also having a data center technologies and private cloud technologies. They're also moving some of their business critical applications such as Microsoft Outlook Exchange to Office 365. So the SaaS applications are being adopted more, and what the pandemic has done is change the way we're working. So a lot of their employees are moving to or from the office environments to their home environments, and there's a lot of offloading that is going on from remote offices or home offices directly onto the applications, and applications are also evolving to take advantage of these cloud native technologies, and that's also introducing a lot of complexity. And what this has also done is there's a lot of control that the erstwhile that used to have the IT operations team used to have. They're losing control of some of these environments because of the cloud providers providing some of these technologies and the SDN technologies layering overlay technologies on top of it. So what this is also causing is a humongous amount of data being generated and a lot of automation that needs to happen to solve these problems, right? So machine learning based algorithms to assist the humans is also going to play a huge role, and that's where some of the innovations are happening, right? So but first, before we get into the new use cases that that these cloud technologies and the newer technologies, Brandon, could you give us your perspective on how the on NPM tools have evolved over time and the on-prem use cases that they used to solve, and then we'll get into the cloud use cases that are being introduced.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so historically, network monitoring and even other discrete, management tools allow the network admins to collect various metrics off of their infrastructure, within their virtual four walls, the routers, the switches, the firewalls. I know when I was a network admin, 15, 20 years ago, I was kind of really focused on, my section of the world, the actual network infrastructure, and just making sure that it was performance and healthy. Is it up? Is it down? So you hear, if you look at the FCAPS model, performance and fault, it was really focused, around those elements there. And so, nowadays though, it's not enough to ensure, that things are up and that they're online and that there are no obvious, performance issues within the infrastructure. You really want to focus now so on the end user experience, and so we'll talk more about that. And it's not enough just to ensure, that proper user experience, but you also need to make sure that the network and the underlying infrastructure that you have the proper visibility, into that in order to deliver those services on that front. And so, one of the things that we've started to see from an on-prem NPM perspective is, we talked, a little bit about APIs and the leveraging more of APIs by vendors. And so you're seeing that in some of the newer technologies. Historically, the networking world has been a very SNMP driven world. If you just write to the IFMIB as a monitoring vendor, as new hardware or new technology comes to market, then it just works. It's just supported. But nowadays, APIs provide a lot more richness and flexibility, to the vendors themselves, and so they're exposing more and more data and endpoints, of information through an API. And so, with that, you can stream that, and you're not just no longer just looking at a certain point in time. Every 10 minutes I pull and give me the statistics off of this device every 8 or 10 minutes. Now, I want it in near real time. Because minutes can mean millions of dollars to my business in downtime, or it could mean the difference between a consumer purchasing something from me versus that consumer going to a competitor of mine because of a poor user experience in interacting, with the technology with my business. And so, so that's some of the things that I've been seeing on the on-prem side. But let's talk a little bit more about how cloud is driving use cases today, within IT organizations.
So, as organizations have adopted these clouds and moved some of their applications to the cloud, and also adapted SaaS services predominantly, and with the pandemic playing a huge role and a lot of on-premises VPN concentrators getting overloaded with traffic, some of the SD-WAN technologies have evolved to a case where the customers are able to offload their employees' access to these SaaS services as well as the cloud applications from their remote office edges, right? So this has also introduced complexity into how their end user experience is evolving. So with our networks, that's where the relevance of network synthetics are taking a comeback, right, of sorts, right? And they've been pushed to the forefront, right, to track of the hop by hop analysis, right? And that's some of the newer use cases that are propping up, capturing the end user experience of these remote employees and work from home employees. Similarly, with all this data and all the dynamicism that the cloud introduces, there is a lot of um, use cases that are evolving for real-time monitoring and via streaming telemetry collection mechanisms that the cloud service providers are putting in play, and the streaming telemetry, as we'll talk about in the key new data sources that are being introduced, are bringing in newer use cases for real-time monitoring. And with all this complexity brings in a lot of data and a lot of dependencies that need to be tracked, correlated across the infrastructures and the applications. And that's where the role of machine assisted learning, right, for the humans to make effective root cause analysis, and the field of AI ops as a new thing is emerging, right? So as alluded to, there are a lot of new data sources that are cropping up in addition to the traditional data sources that we have. Brandon, what are these new data sources that are coming into play in this new world that is evolving?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And before I jump into the new data sources, the one thing I want to make sure that, you and I have been talking a lot about APIs and streaming telemetry and some of those newer protocols or data sources that we're going to dive into. But that doesn't mean that SNMP, for example, is going away. SNMP is still going to be very much a trusted method in which to go get data for certain use cases and certain needs. And so, same thing with flow-based technologies. NetFlow and JFlow and SFlow, et cetera. Those aren't going away. If anything, that's evolving. That's augmenting, if you will. You talked a little bit about like an AWS with VPC flow logs, and so being able to stream those in and visualize that along traditional NetFlow based traffic, and so you're still going to have those traditional data sources, but as we've talked about, there are going to be additional data sources and really focused around kind of that end user experience angle. So looking at down at the packet level and being able to understand from a packet perspective, both at a troubleshooting level as well as at an observability level, you know uh, uh, you know what traffic is going down what route, but also as we look at streaming telemetry, as you're talking about some of the hyperscalers, AWS, Azure, GCP, you want to have real time visibility. And so, the one thing that I look at is, the days 10, 15, 20 years ago when I was a network admin and I was focused on just making sure that the infrastructure was performant and was running. Nowadays, I need to focus and make sure that my end users' experiences are positive ultimately. And again, going back to some of our previous points, a polling based methodology doesn't give you always the clearest and full picture there at that point. And so that's really where streaming telemetry can come into play, is giving you, more granular, near real time data stream, for troubleshooting issues as they occur. As organizations try to shift further from being, reactive based to being more proactive, you need to have that real time or near real time view into your infrastructure, into your applications, and ultimately into the data underneath them, so you can, catch those issues before they impact your users and address them. And so, but all these, we've talked about user experience a lot, and again, user experience is not a new concept. It's been out there for many years, but more so at the application level. Looking at real user monitoring with RUM, or synthetic monitoring from a bot perspective. And so, but there's an element of network digital experience. And so, what's the end user's experience at the network level, and where are they potentially seeing latency, or seeing other issues, within the transport mechanism, in interacting with that application. And so, having technology and capabilities that can look at that network traffic or network synthetic level, using technology such as our NetPath technology, which gives you visibility not just into your infrastructure, but also into your ISP's infrastructure and even into the end provider. So let's say, again, we've talked about 365, from Microsoft here a couple times already, and so if I want to understand from my various sites, how is traffic getting to 365, and where are potential bottlenecks or issues, and so again, That way you can be proactive, you know who to call, you know where the problem's at. Is it my problem, or is it Microsoft's problem, or is it, my service provider's problem? So the quicker you can root cause that, the quicker you can get that ultimately addressed and solved, for your end users. And so, um, the other thing too is, the move to SaaS and the various other trends, in moving applications to the cloud, or the adoption of newer WAN-based technologies, is, not giving you kind of the control and the granularity that you want, for monitoring. And so that's again really where this synthetic, looking at it from not just lower in the OSI stack, but looking at it from a layer 7 perspective as well. You can kind of get that complete and full picture on that front. And so, with the dependence and the need, the criticality of the infrastructure and the applications, to your business and to your end users. The other thing that we've been seeing as well is that you're talking to different people within the business. Different people can be impacted, so it's no longer just the traditional network admin or IT operations type person within an organization. There are other people now that are impacted ultimately. And so, Satish, can you shed some light into that, around kind of what types of folks ultimately are going to be impacted here?
Right. Brandon, we touched upon in the market trends. There's a lot of market trends are going on, but we didn't touch upon how the enterprises are evolving with in dealing with these market trends, right? So, as the adoption is increasing, there are net new personas that are appearing in this whole thing, right? Where be it the cloud architects, right? Be it centers of excellence that are being established across organizations, where the cloud center of excellence, where the people from IT operations, network operations, security, and cloud operations are all coming together in going helping the enterprises through this digital transformation. In the end, it's a line of business owners whose applications are being moved to these newer architectures and being facilitated by the net new architectures at the infrastructure and network level. So the line of business owners are also getting affected, and that's where the end user experience for their customers, or be it the employees or internal employees that are using these applications that are so the line of business owners are becoming a key personas that are getting engaged with the netops people, right? Similarly, security is a huge thing, right? A lot of enterprises are getting affected from a security aspect, but with external threats coming in. So the network performance monitoring, with all the data that it is collecting, is can collaborate with the security people, where, be it from a east west movement of these ransomware kind of things, or viruses, right? All the data that gets collected at a packet level, flow level, can be provided to the security teams for further analysis, right? Or which endpoints are connecting to the network, really, which how the data is coming in, going out, right? Will help the security ops people with their thing, with their with trying to get the borders locked down, or the perimeters locked down, or identifying threat actors that are present within the network, right? So these are all the people, and not when we talk about all this transformation that is going on, that one thing that everybody is going through is the agile transformation, be it the infrastructure as a code, the whole DevOps, SecOps revolution that is going on. So those are the ones, when people are moving to the cloud, the DevOps and the SREs are the newer personas that are coming into play. So these are all the net new personas that have are either the existing personas are evolving to, or net new personas that are interested from the data that is being collected from the network performance monitoring tools, right? So we've talked about a lot of things, Brandon, right? We talked about market trends, and we talked about what are the net new use cases, how historically things have evolved. What are your key takeaways, and the key things that you want our audience to walk away with from this things that we have talked about?
Yeah, no, it's another great question. And so, you know, when we talk about the impact of cloud on network monitoring, there's a few things that I ultimately take away. Number one, the amount of data is just continuing to grow. Technologies, are having to absorb, and you know, mining through that is becoming a bigger and bigger challenge for organizations. Two, the means by which technologies are exposing that information to us is continuing to evolve as well. So we talked about streaming telemetry and some other methodologies, which again maybe haven't aren't necessarily new, but they're finally starting to gain traction from an actual deployment and production usage. But I think the other thing too here that sticks with me is that you know the hype cycle or the technology cycle is compressing. It's moving faster, and so new technologies are coming to market all the time. And so with that, again, that's just continuing to compound and add to the data explosion. And so as you look at that, ultimately you need something that's going to help you kind of sift through that data. Otherwise it's going to be a needle in a haystack. I mean, we thought that network monitoring was a challenge in the past. Now it's much more, it's multiplied in many levels. And so you need some technology, that is going to help you really sift through that noise, or cut through the noise. And that's really where AIOps can come into play. That we talked about, with AI and machine learning, what are the things that I truly should pay attention to? And so, that's another thing that I'm taking away here as well, is that machine learning and AI ops is absolutely a technology that you need in a modern observability stack today. And so, and luckily enough, that's something that SolarWinds is actively working on that front. So, but I'm curious, what are your primary takeaways from today, Satish?
Yep. Great. Some takeaways from this, Brandon. So some of the takeaways that I'm taking is the with all this changes in and the technologies and the market trends that are happening, the complexity, right, that the network and the operations people have to deal with is ever increasing. So a tool that provides them with a single pane of glass that across their full stack, right, that helps them to uh, start from their end user experience to the infrastructure level, right, and correlate this data as it is being generated across, right, across the clouds, across the full stack, is a key, right. And the need for real-time monitoring, right, and the streaming telemetry data that is being generated in the dynamic nature of these environments is another key takeaway, right. So, and then the automation of this end to end, right, because of all the complexity involved, it's very hard for a single human to go through and sift through all this data. So as you touched upon, AI ops is going to be a, be a key role, play a very key role, starting from doing anomaly detections or to predictive analysis, right, or predicting failures, right. So that it's not the end users that are seeing this for the first time, but it's the operators that are seeing it and resolving them proactively, right. And to similarly to predictive capacity planning, right. SolarWinds has had a capacity planning for a long time, and uh, ne- doing this and predicting this capacity in the future for all the net new things that can come into play with the whole IT/OT convergence that is happening. There's a lot more data that is going to generate it with all the Internet of Things that is going to come in. So it's going to be a very, very exciting decade for the network performance monitoring tools to come forward. Right? So those are my key takeaways, Brandon, and that's I hope we've gone through a lot of things, and I hope our audiences uh, are going with their own key takeaways. We would love to hear from them, and I hope they've enjoyed, and thanks for tuning in for this presentation.
Absolutely appreciate everybody's time, and thanks for joining us, and look forward to interacting with y'all in the future on Thwack.